we go. Welcome, everybody. And today we welcome Ken Bozeman and also Professor Yvonne Gonzales Redman. So Ken is celebrating the launch of his new edition of Practical Vocal Acoustics. And we'll be talking a great deal about that book today. Ken Bozeman is an emeritus professor of music and holds performance degrees from Baylor University and the University of Arizona, and subsequently studied at the State Conservatory of Music in Munich. And Yvonne is a professor of voice and pedagogy and chair of the voice area at the University of Illinois. And on that note, I'll keep quiet now and hand over to you, Yvonne.
Hello, welcome everyone. Many thanks to you all for taking the time to sit with us and converse about singing, focused on the work of my dear friend, Kenneth Bozeman. My name's Yvonne Redman, and I have the pleasure of guiding this talk today. But I first want to thank the Voice Study Center and Debbie Winter and her crew for organizing this interview. And I also want to extend, of course, my deepest gratitude to Ken for asking me to join you all in this conversation. I was a singer like many of you, and I am still an instructor today. And prior to meeting Ken, I had attended several summer pedagogical workshops that were wonderful, but I wasn't quite finding the answers I wanted to know in understanding registration. And in particular, I was curious what my university baritones and tenors were feeling and why, and how could I make that easier for them in addition to my own singing. So in 2017, a colleague and dear friend of Ken's, Chadley Ballantyne, alerted me to Ken's first book, and I attended his, at that time, second summer acoustic voice pedagogy workshop in beautiful Door County, Wisconsin. And his guest that summer was Ian Howe, and he completed his doctorate and worked with Ken in the NATS intern program and is now, as you may know, a key faculty member of AVPW, as we call it. But it was the first time I was introduced to concepts of acoustic pedagogy, and which for me was sort of a missing piece of understanding vocal registration and performance. And I'll add that understanding vocal registration in classical and contemporary singing for that matter. So I just followed Ken as often as I could, attending numerous AVPWs. And every time I learned something new. So, but it's an honor to host this talk. And I want to get right to our wonderful guest, which is Ken Bozeman. And we've put together some questions for you, but you are welcome to also throw some things in the chat. So Ken, why don't we start with what initially drew you to the intersection of voice science and classical vocal pedagogy?
Sure, and thank you again, Yvonne, for doing this and helping me talk about the new edition. It was really my own personal vocal journey as a singer initially, and then pretty soon in my life, eventually as a teacher of singing, and trying to understand how this worked and how I could help others for my own voice, and then how I could help others, which gets to upon what basis or from what sources do we form a vocal pedagogy? Historically, it's been primarily from successful historic pedagogy to the extent that we individually had access to that through our own teachers, and through writings from historic pedagogues. But then increasingly in the last, depends on how far back you want to go with that, the partnership of voice science also with that to help us with that. And I always maintain I'm a big fan of voice science. I think it's been a fantastic partner in this process, but really voice pedagogy was not founded on voice science. It was founded on historic vocal pedagogy, successful historic vocal pedagogy. So voice science has been a very welcome partner in that process, but not a replacement of that process. So it was always a question of what has worked historically, what were great performers doing. You watch and you listen and try to figure out what they were doing and which teachers did. And then what has been clarified for us by voice science and even in some cases added to of the strategies that we have from voice science. So that's really how that started. To get a little bit more specific, I started off with I sang from as far back as I can remember. I took piano lessons from age 9 on and sang basically in a church music context growing up, playing piano and singing in the choirs, and then eventually in high school musical productions and such. But I never had any voice lessons until I went to college. I assumed going to college that I would be a church musician. I had never really heard, to any great extent, serious classical singing until I went to college. I was in a small town. There was no opera there. And this was in the 50s and 60s, so pre-internet, and just whatever I had access to. Well, when I got to college and began to hear amazing singing by, trained professional singers, the two early influences were Fritz Wunderlich and Jussi Björling, and then all the other tenors that I got from my LP record collection growing. I got so enthralled by the sounds that were possible from the human voice and being a tenor from the tenor voice that I thought, oh, I want to figure out how to do this, see if I can do that. And of course, I became a vocal performance major as an undergraduate and went on from there. I began to notice in those singers early on very thrilling, interesting color changes across their range that then I had to assume, well, that must be what's needed to get the range to work, entirely. And, begin to read in various pedagogy texts, the William Bernard book, at that time was very available to me. And so I assumed this has something to do with vocal registers. And those vocal registers seem to have different colors associated with them. And I began to be very interested. Well, how is that done? And I think, like many of us, I assumed that vocal registers were essentially laryngeal in origin, that the larynx was doing something special that was creating a color change, but that both together enabled access to the full range so that you could do it, healthily and repeatedly over and over again. And so I went on with that assumption for quite a while. In 1981, I sorted things out well enough to sing well enough to get a teaching job and performing along with that, and at Lawrence University in 1977. In 1981, I attended a NATS conference in Minneapolis. And at that time, I was reading, I began to read Sundberg and well, Richard Miller hadn't put out his Structure of Singing yet, but I was reading some of his earlier books. And I went to this NATS conference where Tom Cleveland, a lovely voice teacher and researcher, presented on the pitch of the singer's formant relative to vocal fa or category. And he was indicating from his research how where the pitch of the singer's formant was directly related to how we perceive the category of the voice. And he played at that a tenor voice on a voice synthesizer. He synthesized a tenor voice singing an ah vowel on an F major scale. So I was listening in this, and I noticed, because I'd been attuned to hearing these color changes, and I was trying to figure out what they were. And that synthesized voice did the color changes that I had come to identify as belonging to the passaggio transition of the voice. Well, I was very excited about that. So I ran up afterwards and I said, Tom, what did you program in the synthesizer to accomplish those color changes that are associated with the transition into the upper voice? And he said, well, I didn't program anything. I set the vowel formants for that vowel ah, and I ran a F major scale through that. And it hit me, oh my goodness, it's not laryngeal. It's some acoustic relationship, because the computer has no larynx. It just inputs a pitch with a potential set of harmonics and runs it through a resonance setting for a vowel. but I didn't know what to do with it at that point. But that was the very first, oh my goodness, maybe it's not just laryngeal, maybe it's some acoustic phenomenon. In 1989, I took a sabbatical to work with Richard Miller, whose work I was studying. I was reading Sundberg's wonderful text, and Richard Miller's text was out by then about this. And I was taking a lesson from Richard, and Richard had reported on successful historic Italian pedagogy, in which he described the zona di passaggio, the transition zone of the voice, and you enter that at a primo passaggio, and then you exit it about a fourth later at the secondo passaggio. And during that transition zone, your voice transitions into your true upper voice, which is above the secondo passaggio. I assumed from that this phenomenon would somebody's got to unmute themselves. They're making sound. I assumed from that that phenomenon would happen roughly near the secondo passaggio. Well, I was taking a lesson from Richard, and my A vowel, A, turned over or did that thing at D4, which was the primo passaggio, not the secondo passaggio. And it was a different kind of a sound on the inside. And I said, Richard, what was that? And he said, what was what? I said, what that A vowel just did on D4. Was that okay? He said, I don't know, do it again. So I did it again, same thing happened. He said, yeah, it's fine. End of conversation. Richard knew what it was supposed to sound like. He said, that's fine. My head was going, wah. I was helping Richard set up his laboratory at Oberlin at the time. Richard was a very brilliant man and very good to me, very dear, but he was a little bit of a technophobe. He did not do the technology. He knew what he wanted to know from the technology, but he did not do the technology. I'm not a whole lot better, but I unboxed the KLMetrics 5500 computer spectrogram, set it up, and that was my practice room. So I went back to that practice room, and I began to say, oh, my A vowel turns over there. I notice my vowels turn over, my voice turns over at different pitches per vowel. I said, well, that's interesting. And I said, and this pitch pattern at which these vowels are turning over is paralleling the shape that I've seen in Sundberg of where first formants are located. And we've learned, you know, that first formants of vowels vary per vowel, and they form a pattern different at each vowel. That's first formant pitches that you can hear when I thump that. And in short order, I began to think, it seems to be happening about an octave below where those first formants sit, which is where the second harmonic of a pitch that I'd be singing would be interacting with those. I thought, this is fairly straightforward. Why haven't I read about this somewhere? I'm assuming the scientists are all over this. Well, they weren't. Why? They're doing science. They're not doing voice lessons. It wasn't that big of a deal to them, apparently. I learned later that Donald Miller, also a voice teacher, who was becoming a voice scientist and paired up with Harm Schutte in the Netherlands, was observing the same thing at the same time. Only they were doing it in serious science studies, and I was doing it as a singer in the studio, trying to sort this out, reading pedagogy texts. At any rate, that was the big aha moment, and that transformed my teaching of that primo passaggio, which I'm now referring to. I called it at the time the male passaggio. Now with the evolution of gender language, I'm calling it the lower passaggio. It's the passaggio that we all have. It's my upper passaggio, the non-treble voice upper passaggio. It's the lower passaggio of treble voices, sopranos, mezzos, countertenors, but it's the same acoustic phenomenon. But it transformed my teaching. And then as I went further, I eventually learned that, well, what happens the octave higher where the voice crosses that first resonance, first formant location in treble voices, and how do I handle that? So that's a pass at how I got involved in all this. So I'm always looking at successful historic pedagogy, which I have great respect for, voice science, what we've putting them together with voice science, and then teacher expertise and experience out of the studio, which these three categories have been very well framed by Kari Reagan in her evidence-based voice pedagogy framework as the source for a workable voice pedagogy. Long answer to your question, but that's
Yeah.
my answer.
First of all, Ken, I think some people weren't able to hear your tapping, and so I
Hmm.
wonder if your
All
original
right.
sound is on.
Thank you very much. I will fix that. I should have had that done. Here we go. There's another way you can do that with ingressive glottal clicks. You're probably hearing something about like that. My first formant locations for that set of cardinal vowels.
Excellent. Thank you, Ken. I do want to point out that one of my favorite paragraphs in chapter 15, for those of you who have your books, is how Ken says that acoustic pedagogy will not function well in a pedagogic vacuum, but it's one aspect of the whole equation. And I just point that out because it's one of the things I appreciate about your pedagogy. The other thing you touched on that I would like point out to people who own the book is chapter 17. He has a nice little instructional technology chapter for those of you who may be like me, a little bit intimidated. It's not that long and it's very helpful as a guide when you're working through the material. So I just want to point that out. Well, Ken, if you're ready, I'd like to ask you another question.
Please do.
Can you tell us, since I'm talking about the book directly, tell us about how this third book came into existence? So, what did you feel needed to be communicated or clarified since your previous publications on practical acoustic registration?
So just very briefly, how the first book came before this one. I was invited by my dear friend from college days, who was a best friend of Joanne, my wife, Kathy Wilson, who at that time was the vocal editor for Pendragon Press. She said she had tried to get me to write a pedagogy book since the 90s. And I had decided in the 90s, this is no longer a single person project. You need a team of people that specialize in all these amazing areas of vocal pedagogy. Well, by the time she asked me again, I knew enough about the acoustics that I said, well, I think I could write something about the acoustics. So I wrote the first book with her encouragement and her editing with Pendragon Press. Well, if you're paying attention to press situations, Pendragon Press eventually went under when its editor passed away, was bought by Rowman and Littlefield, which then was bought by Bloomsbury Press. So I'm now in my third publisher. And each time I got a new publisher, I was asked, do you want to do an updated edition? So I began thinking about it. And this time I finally decided, okay, the model keeps evolving. I'm a lifelong learner, as we all are. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here bothering with this. We're all lifelong learners. And the model keeps evolving. I learn more and more about how to refine and apply the model. Furthermore, I started a course that Yvonne mentioned coming to. I started it in 2015. The first book was written in 2013. So in 2015, I thought, well, how do we disseminate what I was considering to be, this is really important pedagogic information that I've stumbled across here. My colleagues might be interested in it. How do we disseminate this? And I participated actually in a pedagogy summit in 2012 that I helped coordinate at Ohio State. And there was another one in 2018 with Scott McCoy and Donald Simonson, and I organized these to figure out how can we disseminate new information. So then I started this workshop in 2015 as one way that I could contribute more directly to my piece of it. And then Christian Herbst co-taught with me that year. And then the second year I did it in 2015. Ian Howell, who had been a NETS intern in 2013 and when I was the master teacher, joined me on the faculty. And then he started putting in really good information. So I was learning from Ian. And Chadley Ballantyne had come to one of those early iterations, and he was adding information, so we added him to the faculty. And so we just kept doing this summer workshop and kept evolving and developing the model. And so there's much has happened since the first book. My understanding and my ability to apply it has evolved and continues to evolve every voice lesson pretty much, but certainly every year. So there were new refinements, some corrections, from things that I learned along the way. I'll just throw one out. I had a conversation in 2017 with Wolfgang Saus, the wonderful harmonic singer, when I was in Stockholm at an international congress. And I, like everybody else on the planet, we all perceive, humans perceive brightness is forward and darkness is in back. So I was talking to Wolfgang, and I said, so Wolfgang, I think I must be perceiving my brighter second formant contribution in my mouth and my darker first formant contribution in the back. And he says, oh no, it's just the opposite. I was depressed for 2 days. Because I said, I'm in print suggesting, what I just said, but I knew I was at least smart enough to realize this man knows what he's talking about. He's a harmonic singer. He knows exactly how he's tuning those formants to create harmonic singing. So, but it answered some very important questions for me that came from successful historic pedagogy. The Italians in historic pedagogy claimed the vowels are formed in the throat. They're formed in the pharynx. The pharynx is the mouth of the larynx. And I'd always puzzled over that because I knew that they didn't like throaty singing, but they were perceiving, and I knew from Ian Howell's work, in terms of frequency had vowel-like tone colors, that it was higher frequencies that identify most of our vowels. Everything but O and U get their identifying tone color from a higher frequency component, which is being featured by the second formant. Well, if those higher, brighter second formant identifying things are pharyngeal, the Italians were right from historic successful pedagogy. Help me reorient. So now I reorient, and rather than thinking bright to the front and dark to the back, I reorient the way I'm thinking about vowels, and I put the bright part of the vowel in the back and the dark part in the front. Since I'm on that topic, I'll just go off on it. Our native instinct of putting bright to the front, now that I know that a vowel is made of 2 vowel tone colors, a lower one and a higher one being featured by the resonances of the vocal tract, if I put the bright one in the front, it raises my larynx and constricts my throat. If I do E, it raises the larynx and constricts. If I do dark in the back, also wrong, it depresses my larynx. Neither of those are good options. If I think bright in the back, the E identity, E, and the dark in the front. By the way, please mute yourself if you're watching so that we don't have interference. If I put dark in the front, it turns out it's literally an U vowel blended with an E vowel, because we tend to hear the complementary vowel blended together with the target vowel, which is the identifying. So it's an U and an E blended, which is an E. I can put that in the front, E. I get essentially the same sound no matter which one I'm thinking about. Whereas if I think E bright in the front or E dark in the back, I get 2 bad alternatives. Anyway, so these further evolutions needed to be incorporated, and I incorporated these in my second book, Kinesthetic Voice Pedagogy, which is also in a second edition with Scott McCoy's Inside View Press. But I incorporated parts of that information in this new edition of Practical Vocal Acoustics. I'm by contract, just so you know how publishing works, I'm by contract required to not render the other book irrelevant. So I have to keep some information a little bit discreet in each book, but I also want to give as much as I can. There's overlap between the 2 books inevitably because it's talking about the same basic ideas. But anyway, I incorporated some new information on spectral tone color from Ian Howell, some new information on auditory roughness, buzziness from Ian Howell in this new edition, and some work from Chadley Ballantyne on somatosensory palæsthesia, sensation of vibration. I call that, I'm too pleased with myself for this title, I call it locational somatosense, which is the fancy way of saying placement. We know that you can't actually place sound, but we feel sound moving around in our body across range, so I call it locational somatosense, where your body is feeling the locations of the sound across the range. All of those things are in the new book. It's about 50 pages longer, still fairly concise. The text part of the book is about 140 or 50 page, 140 pages, I think, with appendices and definitions and so forth beyond that. So still relatively concise.
Ken, thank you so much. You know, I had a question about the key pieces of your pedagogy, and you really hit on a lot of those. Bright in the back, warm in the front, the target and complementary vowels, the auditory roughness, and then there were two things though that I've heard from you that I would like you to explain a little bit more, maybe for the listeners. Is you always say language is the problem and expression is the solution. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that
Sure,
part of your pedagogy?
sure. And so basically, this instrument from ancient history uh, was programmed, and your choice, by nature or by God, however you view that. To me, those are not mutually exclusive categories. Um, for the expression of feeling, that is its deep level programming, its design. Expression of feeling predated language, probably by millennia. There are even cultural anthropologists that maintain, I don't know how they figured this out, but that's not my area, that group singing predates language. So that was group expression of feelings. That's what that was. It's how creatures, and it's also true in the other mammalian other creatures that make sounds, mammals, they're bonding as with their tribe or their herd in the expression of feeling, howling, all kinds of things. So our deepest level programming for playing this instrument is expression of feelings. That really then necessarily has to be the foundation of our pedagogy. Expression organizes everything vocal.
Wonderful.
And we just need to sit with that. Everything is organized by expression of feeling. Language came later. We realized, I can make a wide range of sounds. I could organize these different sounds into linguistic units and give specificity of thought to my feelings. And not only communicate my basic needs to my parent or my caregivers or my tribe, but I can actually add very specific informational content with language. Well, what's the problem with that? Our output targets for those sounds of language essentially come from a fairly narrow, low part of the range when we're not being overly emotional. And we incorrectly assumed that the sounds and sensations from that part of the range will sound and feel the same through the entire compass of the voice. That's not true. It's not possible. It's not true. So language, the addition of language, was a new complication when we tried to extend language across the full compass of the feelingful sounds that we were making with this instrument. And so we tried to insist on the same output targets across range. So language becomes the problem. Now, when I say language is the problem, I rush to add, I love language. You shouldn't be a singer if you don't love language. Okay, I love language, but it's a problem when I try to extend its colors and sensations in the body and expect them to stay the same across range. I have to let them migrate, as they did when I was just doing feelings with this thing. If I just do feelings, everything migrates. The sounds migrate, the sensations migrate, and they get comfortable. I'm going to pair that with another thing that Ingo Tietze, who studies both human and animal vocalizations, he did a lovely article for the Journal of Singing, which I'm on the editorial board in 2021, in which he made this statement using sciencey language. He said, synergistic biological systems Don't run for the hills. That just means interactive living things. Science is for interactive, like us and like animals. Synergistic, interactive, biological living things tend to self-organize for efficiency. Wonderful. If they are given or have appropriate and clear output targets, and they have sufficient flexibility to explore solutions for those output targets, they will tend to find efficient solutions. They will tend toward efficiency. Well, I add to that, well, why do they do that? Pleasure. Efficiency feels good. Inefficiency doesn't feel good. Why would some animal tend toward efficiency? Because it feels better, including the human animal. So we tend toward efficiency because efficiency is in harmony with the non-injurious function, with the efficient function of the anatomy that we're playing. So back to my so expression, language is the problem, but pleasurable, satisfying expression, self-soothing expression is the solution. And when we do that, when we let that dominate, I say things like, suggest the language, insist on the affect, insist on the feeling. Expression organizes everything. You will inhale differently when you have something to say than if you're just sitting there breathing. If you have something to say and you're already eager to share it, you're motivated by the feeling of wanting to convey feeling, the feeling that goes along with what you had to say. You will notice that your abdominal muscles, the low part of your torso, the pelvic area, has a certain muscular tonicity. When you're loaded for bear, we say, if you're loaded for bear, you really have something you really want to say that has feelings, right? You don't go blasé relaxed down there. As important as a certain amount of relaxation is down there to allow nice diaphragmatic descent, you will not go completely lax. You're already toned and tuned to express feelings. There's flexibility, but there's also a certain amount of tonicity. And as that descending diaphragm meets that resistance, that causes its outer fibers to expand your chest. So an inhalation inspired by the desire to express feelings will be led by the diaphragmatic expression, but it very quickly transfers to a circumferential ribcage expansion. And it's all done by expression. All I have to do is have something to say. And if I inhale that way, my body is sorted by expression. I don't have to micromanage all the parts. Furthermore, that expression simultaneously is tuning my pharynx. You say I'm kind of worried about something, and that's what I want to express immediately. The whole system is tuned with that sort of childlike, help me, mommy, expression. It's tuned my pharynx. It's tuned the shaping and tonicity of the muscles of my pharynx to convey that feeling to my mommy, as the little toddler, thinks there's a monster under the bed. You got to come in here quickly and help me. Furthermore, that expression will tune the nature of my vocal onset. An expression-generated vocal onset, surprise, surprise, is not a coordinated onset, which is also a good onset, by the way. It actually is a coup de glotte onset. Mm-hmm. The glottis closes immediately prior to the phonation when we have feelings to express. E, a, it isn't E, a, it's E, a, E, a. Why? Because Garcia was right. Early voice scientist, voice teacher, mostly voice scientist secondarily. That is the most efficient sound producing way to start a sound. It's a very gentle, preset, pre-closure right before the phonation. It's about that quick before the phonation. E, a, instead of e, a, which is also a healthy way to start, but it's less immediately efficient and robust. So basically expression is the solution. It is the organizing principle of everything vocal, because this instrument was designed to express feelings. And language came later and challenges that, but you can combine them very beneficially with and what does acoustic vocal pedagogy do?
Yeah. You just got to my next question.
It explains what are appropriate output targets per range, so that you can understand, how do my output targets have to migrate? How does the sound percept need to migrate per range so that I have appropriate output targets for the range I'm attempting, and many other things.
Well, and I think too, Ken, this leads us into the next part that I really wanted to talk about today was, in my teaching, one of the most unique elements of your pedagogy that I find very useful in preparing students for sound onset is the chiaroscuro whisper. So can you describe that to us and its benefits?
Yes. And just briefly, why did I come up with this curious thing? I'm a big fan of Donald Miller and Harm Schutte and their work in Groningen. And when I realized, they observed the same thing I observed, but they did it really with very careful science studies instead of just in the studio. And he also was very much involved in the development of the Voce Vista Voce Vista spectrograph app. And he was using the vocal fry to help identify the location of vowel resonances and vowel formants. Why? Well, if you input a noise into your resonator, any kind of way that you can input a noise contains a broad sweep of frequencies. And the more frequencies you can input, the ones that the tuning of your resonator is tuned to, they will be featured in the sound that you get, and the ones that it is not tuned to will be suppressed. So he was using the vocal fry. I had unfortunately evolved a vocal health issue in which the tissues of my vocal folds, particularly the thyroarytenoid muscles, which are the bulky mass of the vocal folds, were gradually wasting with age. This happens to older biological male bodies with a much higher percentage than biological female bodies, and not to all, but to a pretty significant percentage of us. It was happening way early in my case, which usually occurs, a muscle wastes usually from lack of use, which made no sense at all because I was singing quite a bit and with my full range, including chest register, which that muscle is responsible for. But at any rate, all that to say, my vocal folds were wasting and gradually bowing, creating bowed vocal folds from the wasting and shrinkage to the side. Well, you can't do a good vocal fry with bowed vocal folds. But I was studying the acoustics and trying to learn how to use it, and I thought, well, I can't easily do a very comfortable, well-executed vocal fry. What can I do? So I began to play with this whisper, where I get the chords close enough together to generate a noise, which has basically an infinite number of frequencies, so that the sound coming out of my mouth would show me which frequencies was my vocal tract preferentially featuring. And it would be featuring a peak of my lowest resonance, my first resonance, in the first formant, which is the radiated result of my first resonance, and in the second resonance, and in higher ones. And I began to play with this, and I realized, okay, it's got to be a whisper that is analogous to good singing, not the typical whisper, which is very high frequency dominant. Humans have a high frequency bias. Why is that? Our hearing is better at higher frequency. Our hearing is most sensitive in the top octave of the piano. We hear those frequencies the most prominently. Low frequencies, we feel low frequencies. Thank you, Chadley Ballantyne. But we can't feel high frequencies. Shock and awe. We cannot feel frequencies above 1,000 hertz. That's soprano high C, roughly. Any frequencies above that, we think we're feeling, but we're not. We're feeling low frequency content. We feel low frequency content better, which we feel at the strongest around middle C, C4, and it dies by C6. We hear high frequency content better around C7 to C8, top octave of the piano, and it's weaker lower. So there's a very difference between those two. Anyway, if you input a noise, noise contains just a broad sweep of frequencies, but we are biased to hear high frequencies better, and so we tend to cheat our production towards the bright frequencies. And because we feel bright frequencies to the front, we think bright frequencies are to the front. It's wrong, but we think that. That's our perception. Both of those tend to make our typical whisper mouthy spread and high frequency dominant. Kind of a spread, not very clearly pitched. So I had to adjust that for well set up classical successful historic pedagogy chiaroscuro timbre to come up with and how do I do that? Expression. I use self-soothing expression to set up my resonator. I'm so sorry your dog died today. Empathy. And all of a sudden I started getting very specific pitches. But even specific first formant pitches. And then I knew I learned, if I play around with that, I can learn how to really carefully and very soothingly tune all those vowels. And then I learned beside that, if the target sound is coming from that higher second formant, which is being tuned pharyngally, bright in the back, dark in the front, what about when I need to actively modify vowels? And when do I need to start doing that? As soon as I'm singing higher than the first resonance of a vowel, my fundamental frequency, the pitch I'm singing, is falling in the valley between my first resonance and my second resonance and is not being resonated. I'm going to back up a second just to point out, there is no resonance below middle C. All first formants, the lowest resonance of the vocal tract in a really deep bass voice, might be as low as about a middle C. Nothing below that. They sing well below middle C, but the first part of their output that's being really resonated starts at about middle C and higher. And most resonances are higher than that, because your E is your low. Your first formant of your E vowel is very low, but your first formant of your A vowel is an octave higher than that. Anyway, so if you input a noise, you can find out where those resonances are, and you can learn to tune them well. And whenever you're singing above that first resonance, the pitch you're singing is falling in a non-resonant area, a valley in between resonances. If you want, but your warmth and roundness and fullness of sound is dependent on your first resonance. It's the only part of your sound that's below the top of the treble clef. If you're not resonating something there, you're left only with high, bright resonances, which will sound thin and shrill. So you have to start raising the first resonance with the pitch you're singing once you're singing higher than that. So for my E vowel, when I sing above the bottom of the treble clef, I have to start actively modifying it. How can I use the chiaroscuro whisper to teach me how to do that. Well, I know the identity of the E vowel comes from that way high pitch. The warmth comes from, how can I raise that? I can open my mouth more. How can I keep making an E vowel as I open my mouth more? Because that's not the way I say an E in speech. I keep targeting this. I'm targeting this. First form is rising, second form it stays true. So basically I developed this way of learning how to tune for vowel modification while I'm still trying to preserve an intelligible language output target, that E vowel in that case. Same thing with an A. I don't actually have to modify an A vowel. I can, but I don't have to. Why? That A first formant is on my high, pretty close to my high C. I could modify it way up there. Most of my range, I don't have to modify that A. But sopranos sing higher than that. So how would they modify that? As long as you produce the pitches that I've given for classical targets for that vowel, it will produce an understandable, intelligible A vowel, and if you open the mouth appropriately, with warmth. If you don't open the mouth appropriately as you sing higher than that first format, that A vowel is going to get thin and shrill pretty quick. So you can use this tool to find the appropriate tuning for any vowel anywhere in the range. And if you want to do CCM, you just use different pronunciation targets, because it's largely just a question of where those things are tuned is largely a matter of pronunciation. So I offer this set for classical. And I offer this set, not my main gig, but I'm trying to be helpful for every genre, because acoustics, everybody's playing the same acoustics, you're just making different choices, that's all really. And trying to find the most pleasurable way to make those different choices so that you can do 7 shows a week and not hurt yourself, right? I offer these choices for CCM. They're slightly brighter. So it's the classical was B, A, G, D, B, A, G. You can look up Counterscore to Whisper on my website or on YouTube and find this. For CCM, I sharp everything but the B. So B, A sharp, G sharp, D sharp. So it's like G sharp minor. Instead of warmer classical vowels, brighter, slightly brighter set. I've still got to tune them with complete soothing comfort in my neck, so I'm not doing anything uncomfortable. But then the other thing that's cool about it is you can rehearse everything that you do in singing other than the actual sung pitches. Like affect, you can use every affect. I can use empathy. I'll go back to classical because that's the one I mostly use. I can use mischief. I can use something that I use for CCM styles, but even in classical to some extent. In polite company, I call it confident assertion. In vernacular, I call it, in pop music, I call it the hell yeah, damn right affect. And you get that, you get that eye squint, nose scrunch. Notice same, or if I use the, same pitch targets, same comfort in the neck, but whatever, by the way, I'm not just squinting my eyes, expression is doing this. Expression is playing everything. If you do it with honest expression and comfort in the neck, it's not a problem. It will feel good, it will be efficient. And those will be good positions for the genres that call for that attitude or that affect. And expression includes attitude, caricature, feelings. There are output targets that you have that you must do pleasurably so that it feels easy in the neck. Whatever else expression does, however else it plays your body, the neck has got to be very comfortable. That's where you feel too great of a transglottal pressure difference, which is a fancy way of saying vocal effort.
And we did get a question about that, Ken. It's,
Yeah.
as a teacher, what are you listening for? What are you trying to accomplish something that feels good for the singer?
Well, yes, across range. I mean, well, if it depends on the genre as to what I'm listening for. It's got to be genre-specific timbre and diction, for that matter. So for classical, I'm listening for chiaroscuro balanced timbre, which is a balance of the low and the high content of the sound. And the low spectral content of the sound comes from flow phonation and an appropriately tuned first formant. Okay, Chiaro comes from appropriately ringing high spectral content, which that second formant in the singer's formant cluster gives me. I'm also listening in classical for what I refer to as vibrant singleness of pitch, which is vibrato where you don't hear the vibrato. You hear a very stable pitch, but your ear is unable to is not tracking pitch waggle or pitch beating. It hears a smoothly vibrant. You can tell it's vibrant. Sounds interesting. It sounds alive, sparkling, spinning, but you're not hearing pitch waggle or wiggle. And ideal vibrato will be vibrant and single in pitch. Within classical, we will tolerate some awareness of pitch undulation, but if you get very far away from vibrant singleness of pitch, you will please fewer people, basically. Your audience size will shrink. The closer you are to vibrant singleness of pitch. So I listen for vibrant singleness of pitch and legato. There are various characteristics of sort of traditional classical sound. And some of those carry over to other genres, and some of them they're slightly different. The chiaroscuro isn't so prominent in some other genres, but comfort and efficiency so that you can sing healthily is common to all genres, professional genres.
Yeah, I think the question is that seems to be coming from the chat room is, so you've set the whisper, and what happens as soon as the instructor and the singer have set the whisper in the instrument?
You have learned using the chiaroscuro whisper how to tune a vowel per a genre and what it feels like and sounds like from the inside. So if I do a that sounds and feels very different from So when I sing an E vowel, and if I don't have to modify it, if it's low enough I don't have to actively modify it, it contains some of that E. It's not just it has some of that warming. So if I sing through that sensation that I've just rehearsed, E, or speak through it, E, it has both overvowel and undervowel components. It has both first and second formant components. E, A. We tend, because of our brightness bias and because of our language target bias, to over-articulate the target component. And it screws up the system when we do that. We tend to over-articulate the target sound, which in most cases is the higher, brighter one, and we tend to go E, A, instead of allowing enough of that neutralizing, warming, rounding, complementary undervowel in most cases. E, A, that's the one we want. E, A balance of target and complement. And the chiaroscuro whisper lets you hear and feel what it would be. By the way, so largely the problem with that language poses is too much bright overvowel, too much target vowel in most cases, and not enough complement. But we've trained ourselves in our language training to only attend to the target sound and to exaggerate and over-articulate the target sound and neglect that comforting, warming, neutralizing. It is neutralizing. It's warming and rounding and neutralizing complementary undervowel color, and we have to allow it back in. Furthermore, as you go up the range, you have to allow more and more complementary vowel tone color. That's the solution to range, not more and more target. You can't go E as you go higher. You have to go E, ah. And I'm doing a presentation at the PAVA conference on how do you find the complementary tone color, since we're not usually paying attention to it. And there's several ways. There's more of it in a good high voice. There's more of it when you diminuendo. When you sing softly, the high end of your sound reduces more than the low end. So you hear more of the lower end, which is more the complementary vowel. So I just ran across a lovely YouTube presentation by Jack Livigny, if you know who that is, very fine tenor and teacher of successful historic Italian pedagogy, which I respect, right? I love it. He said, he wasn't talking about in my terms, acoustic terms. He said, when you go through the passaggio, how do you do that safely so that you don't use too thick of a chord, right? I love this. I say similar things, but I didn't say it the way he was saying it. I love the way he says it. He said, you want to sing the color of a vowel when you do that vowel softly.
Very nice.
Well, when you do a vowel softly, you are featuring more of its undervowel tone color and allowing the target overvowel tone color to diminish a little bit. So if I do ah, 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 it's got more ah. So as you go higher, he said it this way, which is a funny way, but I love it. He said, sing the soft color of the vowel loudly.
That's a nice way to put it.
I love it.
Well,
I say sing more undervowel. I said allow more undervowel tone color to come into the sound as you go higher. Let it to migrate more undervowels. Same thing said a different way. Yeah.
Well, Ken, thank you so much. We are just a minute or two away from our full hour of talking. Can you believe how quickly it goes? And you certainly have given everybody a lot to think about. I want to just point out that I have one of my favorite things as a pedagogue that Ken includes is he includes some listening examples for you. He includes vocal exercises that help explain some of these registration shifts that you or your student might feel. And he actually has a chapter on belting, which he sort of touched on a little bit tonight. And I sort of appreciate that he gives that, it's a chapter in his book, acknowledging that so many of us now are teaching multiple music styles. So Ken, do you want to just leave us with one more thought before we close up, that about maybe some future presentations you're doing?
I'm doing several classes for the Voice Study Center that go into these things in more depth and detail, as in the books. You know, we're dealing with people's souls when we deal with their voices, because they very much identify with the sound of the voice and the use of the voice. So it's a very important business to help people express themselves more fully and completely. And so you're all in a great profession doing very important work. I hope that my work is helpful in that regard. I guess that would be it. I would just say about the exercises, they're largely built to encourage appropriate migrations of sound and sensation across range. That's what they're designed to help with, so that we can let the expression reorient us as we do language across range. And thank you, Yvonne, for hosting this.
It's my pleasure. Ken, you are getting so many thank yous in the chat. Thank you, Ken, for your warmth and knowledge. It really helps to see and hear you in person, to complement what we can pick up from your book. And I completely agree. So on that note, I want to turn it over to Peter, but thank you all for joining us. This is really delightful. And have a great day, everybody.
Well, thank you, Ken. I've got nothing more to add to that. Thank you very much. It's a very inspiring, informative session. Thank you.
And thanks to everyone that chimed in and watched. I hope that you find some usefulness in it.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers.